MP Joe Swinson, the feminist writer Germaine Greer, and the Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Well, I've never known a question time when we've had an overwhelming number of questions on this one topic, so let's take it straight away. And the question's from Rachel Gilbert.
We're being committed to radical long-term policies for which no one has voted. Is Archbishop Rowan Williams correct?
That's his quote. We're being committed to radical long-term policies for which no one has voted. Is the Archbishop correct? Charles Clarke.
I think he's right to speak out. I don't think he's right in his analysis. I don't think the government is in fact got fundamental long-term radical policies. In a sense, I wish it had. I think what it should be characterised with over this first year of its office is incoherence and incompetence in a wide range of different policy areas. We've seen it just this week on sentencing policy, on NHS reform, a range of issues. If I thought that there was a coherent vision and strategy in the government which was taking us in a disastrous path, in a sense I'd be more worried. But it's a really bad situation, in my opinion, when they haven't thought through their proposals. Elected police chiefs is yet another example. So I think the Archbishop's criticism is right to happen, but I think the grounds of his criticism is not correct.
So you mean you should have said something quite different?
He should have said that the government's incoherent and doing great damage through that incoherence, rather than saying it has a coherent long-term strategy, because I don't think it has.
Okay. Peter Hitchens.
Well, it's certainly true that nobody voted for this. A number of deluded people voted Conservative in the belief that they would get a Conservative government, and some more deluded people voted Liberal Democrat in the belief that, as a result, they would get a left-wing government. And neither of them got what they wanted. The Liberal Democrats have dropped many of their pledges, and we know about those, particularly the university arrangements and many, many other things.
Why do you call them all deluded? The people who voted Conservative presumably meant to, and the people who voted Liberal Democrat meant to.
Because it was quite plain from the behaviour and speeches and activities of David Cameron and his lieutenants that he was hoping, if he became elected, to govern the country as a Liberal. And he has been very happy indeed to have the support of the Liberal Democrats against what remains of his own right wing, to make sure that he can be soft on crime. That he continues to spend very highly on certain areas of public spending which are unpopular with his supporters, that he continues to let the country be absorbed into the European Union, to name just a few of the areas in which he's not been Conservative at all. He's very happy with this. He isn't the prisoner of Nick Clegg.
So what about what the Archbishop...
And he's the willing prisoner.
What about what the Archbishop said?
I'm puzzled as to why an Archbishop should take this particular view, particularly where he speaks about the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor being revived. I think an awful lot of people who pay very large sums of money in tax and then see people living close to them, living off that tax and not doing any work for it, would like to see the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor revived. And also I would point out that that distinction arises out of the Christian religion. So I don't really see why this is a Christian thing to say. He sounds to me very much like a disappointed Liberal Democrat rather than like an Archbishop.
Okay.
I think he's absolutely right, but he's not alone. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people, in fact, are extremely angry about what this government is doing.
Yes.
They are forcing through people to pay thousands of pounds for education, bringing in changes to the NHS and competition that wasn't in their manifesto. But we are angry and we are going to take action about this because they can't make ordinary people pay for this crisis, not of their making. That anger is coming to fruition. Thousands of people are going to be voting and taking action later in this year against this government's policies.
You said that the man at the top there in the third row from the back.
Can I ask, please, why the panel think that such a big say should be given to a person supported by such a small minority in this country?
The Archbishop.
The Archbishop.
Joe Swinson.
Well, He's obviously entitled to his views and to express those views, and I think very often he plays a very important part in public life. But I do think he's wrong when he says nobody voted for this. 10 million people voted Conservative, 7 million people voted Liberal Democrat. That's a much higher percentage of the population that actually voted for the parties making up this government than we're used to. The previous Labour government was governing with a majority on only 35% of the vote. I think it's slightly curious that he's using this argument about what people have voted for when the Archbishop is a outspoken critic of any kind of House of Lords reform to bring democratic legitimacy into that place, which nobody votes for at the moment. But the one place where I think he is right to highlight, and I see it in my constituency surgeries, is that people are very worried about the current situation. You know, we've got a situation where our economy has effectively gone through a massive heart attack, where people are finding life very difficult, often having a pay freeze, concerned about job security and facing rising costs. We're in a very difficult recession that we're trying to find our way out of. Growing the economy is very important, and I think all of the decisions that the government's making to cut the deficit in order that we can have that healthy economy for the society that we want to see are being made with that recognition. And it's very close in my mind all the time that these are decisions we're making that are making life difficult, but there is no easy alternative, and I think it's important to bear that in mind, because the alternatives of having a ballooning deficit and much higher debt interest payments in the future are not a price that I want our future generations to pay.
What the Archbishop said is that your government doesn't know how afraid people are, and the anxiety and anger have to do with the feeling that they're not having proper public argument about the decisions that are being imposed on the country. That's what he actually says.
Well, I think that, as I just said, I do understand the concerns that people have. And,
no, but do you think he's right to say, you say you have, but the government doesn't? That's the point.
I
mean, I know you're only a junior member of the government. If the PPS is a member of the government, I'm not quite sure.
I think MPs are actually very aware of these difficult decisions, and I don't think anybody is taking these difficult decisions with any degree of relish, but it is absolutely vital that we get the economy back on track, and you just can't continue doing that with the deficit that we've had.
Just repeat the question. We're being committed to radical long-term policies for which no one has voted. The man there in the second row.
Under Labour, there's no social justice. I've got Asperger's syndrome. I was kicked out of 3 schools, and my local MP, Bob Blizzard, said, I don't care. We've had this from Labour. When it's only in 2005, when the Conservative County Council got elected, they'd done something. So yes, the coalition has done something right. And we get this from Labour. We're there for the working class. No, you're not. You're there to line your own pockets.
OK, well, they're not there anymore, so I don't know about that. The woman there in the 4th row from the back. Yes.
In answer to Peter Hitchens, it's ludicrous, it seems to me, to describe in any way as a Liberal a Prime Minister under which the most vulnerable are under attack, and the people who've done best in the last year are people right at the top of the income bracket. And in answer to Joe Swinson, those of us who voted Liberal Democrat don't feel that we've got what we voted for because we hardly noticed that you're there.
OK. I'll come back to you. Andrew Mitchell, you're the most senior representative of the government that came under attack from the Archbishop. What do you make of it?
Well, he's absolutely entitled to his view and his contribution. I do not agree with him. He wasn't, incidentally, Charles, very nice about the Labour Party either, whom he castigated pretty strongly. But on the 2 substantive points he makes, first of all, that no one voted for this coalition government. This is actually the first government since 1935 which has got more than 50% of the popular vote behind it. So I think he is wrong on that point. In addition to that, if he says that coalitions are not democratic, then effectively he is disowning most of the governments across Europe. So I think he is wrong on that point.
But hang on a second. He said we're being committed to long-term policies for which no one voted. He didn't say nobody voted Conservative, nobody voted Liberal. He's talking about the agreement that the Tories and the Liberal Democrats made after the election, which, as we know, Joe Swinson said there'd never be tuition fees in university. She said, and now you've got it. That surely is what the Archbishop is referring to.
David Cameron said no top-down reform of the NHS.
That's what he's referring to, isn't it?
The point is this, that these are the policies of a coalition government, both the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, who have come together in the national interest, burying their party political differences, to try and sort out the dreadful economic mess which we have inherited.
But by definition, nobody can vote for coalition policies, can they? Because they don't know what they are until you've got the coalition.
That is true, but nevertheless...
But that's what he's saying.
But the two parties who make up this coalition, for the first time since 1935, have more than half the popular vote. And I think that is a point which he misses in his comments. I just want to make this...
by saying what they were going to do.
I just want to make this point as well. We are taking this action, not because we want to take it, but because we have got to take it to protect living standards across the country from the dreadful effects of the inheritance we had from Labour and the attack on living standards that would result if we did not get the deficit down.
Whatever... hold on a second. Peter Hitchens.
But you keep going on about these votes that you got. You didn't get them by saying what you were going to do.
Okay, Germaine Greer.
You said them in both these parties got these votes by pretending that they were going to do things which they weren't going to do, and pretending they weren't going to do things which they were going to do.
Peter,
in any other business, this would be
a
false prospectus. You can't get away with it in business.
There's never been any other kind of prospectus.
Yes, there has.
That's not true at all.
Let Germaine speak.
Everybody's forever nagging that governments don't carry out what was in their manifesto. Now, in this case, it's even more interesting because one of the things that happened under presidential-style New Labour is that parliamentary government was weakened in a great many ways. The power of cabinet was suddenly sidelined. We began to have rule by fiat, which was invented by Margaret Thatcher, who told her policies to Rupert Murdoch before she told them to anybody else. When you've got a situation like that, issues are not argued on their merits. We end up with government by fiat. What's happened in this case is, to someone who is a European, profoundly exciting and interesting. The Tories now have to argue their case in front of the Lib Dems. They will arrive at a compromise. This is the way government goes in this country historically anyway. It's one reason why we're still sane. And interestingly, whatever government we had now would still be under pressure from the universities after years and years of underfunding to raise fees, or allow them to raise fees.
Where are you on the Archbishop?
Well, it's nothing to do with me. I'm a Catholic.
Hold on. Let me just hear from some more members of the audience. So they're locked with their hands up. Man in the pink shirt there. Then I'll come to you up there in red. Yes.
I'm a high school governor, and the changes to the education are just insane. The English baccalaureate that has been dreamt up is one of the most dumb things I've ever heard. It's just so depressing. We have a really diverse range of students.
Is that your main instance of where the government, in your view, has gone wrong? I mean,
well, it's just one of the kind of crazy things that just is not necessary to try and save on the deficit. It's just insane.
Okay, and the woman in red up there.
I think that he did have a right to say something because he is a citizen of this country. And I think that a lot of people feel like they have been silenced. And the good thing about him saying what he did today was it's opened this debate. Because I think there is a time where people say enough is enough. And I think that time has come. So now is the time to look at all, the working class, to look at everybody and try to make sure that even if we do need to have cuts, we try to make sure that they're fair and equitable.
Because he did, Andrew Mitchell, he did say, didn't he, complained of what he called a quiet resurgence of the seductive language of deserving and undeserving poor. In other words, that you were starting to make a distinction between people who needed welfare, people who didn't need to be on welfare. Is that a fair criticism?
No, it's not. And I also think that if you look at the reforms that Ian Duncan Smith, the welfare minister, is trying to carry out, to try and make sure that work pays, to try and make sure that people get back into the world of work from not being so where they can. These are very important reforms that are long overdue, and I think the government deserves great credit for actually grasping this nettle and tackling this issue, which for far too long has been ignored by politicians.
Okay. The woman, yes, you, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
I don't think it's fair to say that politicians have been ignored. I think that actually the Prime Minister's response to the Archbishop of Canterbury today has been extremely contradictory. it has been proven that the government needs to listen. That's why the NHS reform was halted, to implement some listening exercises. And Dr. Rowan Williams' worries and concerns should be listened to and should be explored. I think the response today has been far too quick, and I think it has angered the public.
David, I completely agree with what the lady has said and what the lady earlier said. Look, let's be quite clear about it. Firstly, the coalition was entitled to form the government. They had a majority of seats. It gave stability. Though I'm a Labour politician, I recognise Labour was defeated. Secondly, they're entitled to form the government on the basis of a coalition agreement as to what they would do. That was fair too. What they were not entitled to do was firstly ignore the things they'd said prior to the election. The student fees example is a good example. The no top-down reform of the NHS is another good example. What they also had to do and failed to do was to come up with coherent programmes for reform. The gentleman talking about the school curriculum is completely spot-on correct. Schools up and down the country have been thrown into confusion as a result of an incoherent approach taken by the government. Every health centre in Britain is in confusion because we don't know what's happening on the NHS reform. And that's why the Archbishop was right to talk about the anger, despair and fear that so many people in so many walks of life feel because the government's so incoherent and has got back on what both parties said before the election.
All right, I'll take a couple more points.
Surely the Archbishop of Canterbury has the right, in his role as head of the church, to actually speak out for the hundreds and thousands of people who don't have that right, who don't have a voice, who are the deserving or undeserving poor.
Okay, and the lady in the front here.
I agree for the most part with what Charles Clarke has said, except for I do think that the coalition government has got a coherent policy. It generally just seems to be furthering conservative ideals, basically halting social mobility by raising tuition fees and kneecapping the NHS with all these ridiculous reforms.
Okay, and the point to me,
Wouldn't it be a little bit more helpful if we used the 6.5 million that's being used to bomb Libya at the moment and use that for the 3 million underprivileged children we've got in this country who are living in poverty at the moment?
Very briefly, Joe Swinson, and then we must move on.
I mean, I think the gentleman makes a very good point about children living in poverty, and I'm sure there's people here who watched that very moving documentary earlier this week called Poor Kids. And the truth is, every party at the election had welfare reform in the manifesto, because what that programme demonstrated so clearly was that getting people back into work is absolutely the best way to get children out of poverty. There hasn't been enough support for the way that's been done in the past, and that's what we're absolutely determined to change.
Okay. If you're tweeting tonight, just a reminder, our hashtag is BBCQT. Text us 83981 if you've got views about what's being said that you want to have aired. CFAX page 155. If you put that up, we'll show you what other viewers are saying, or if you're watching digitally, push the red button. Let's go on to a question now from Anne Beaumont, please.
Does the government have any teeth when it comes to the inappropriate sexualisation of children?
There was a report this week on the sexualisation of young children called Letting Children Be Children. Germaine Greer.
If you think about this phenomenon, you have to ask yourself where it really comes from. Who is it, when is it that our children are sexualised? For years and years, 20 years, it's been impossible to buy clothes for little girls that didn't dress them as little tarts, that didn't have sequins on their jeans, that weren't Jordan pink or Katie Price pink. And it became a strange thing that little girls screamed and yelled. They wanted these things. It became like a sort of guerrilla uniform for little girls saying, I am feminine, I'm a girly girl. I don't pretend to understand exactly where this came from. I would even entertain the possibility that they were reacting against a particular kind of feminism that said you've got to be, you know, boyish and tough and not be coy and manipulative and so on. It was extremely depressing for an old feminist like me to watch this phenomenon. But it just grew and grew, and the more mothers said, I will not buy you your 25th Barbie doll, the more screaming and yelling there was until the 25th Barbie doll was got. So there's always been this sinister culture that has gone along, and it's always been sexual. The Barbie doll herself is a fetish. She is descended from a sex toy. Little girls learn to flirt with their fathers, you know, kiss daddy goodnight and all this sort of business. And you wonder whether what's happening in marketing is a response to this or whether it's actually causing it. And in fact, by now, it's become biofeedback. One feeds the other. All you can pray for is that it will run out of steam, that the kids themselves will suddenly think, that's so naff, it's so last year, it's so disgusting, that they just won't do it anymore.
So the government can't do anything about it, and this report to the Mothers' Union can't do anything about it?
If the government decides to censor what is available, if they decide that certain things are not for little girls, they will actually give them added value. They'll make them more glamorous.
So you'd rather they did nothing?
Magazines for 12-year-olds are read by 8-year-olds precisely because they're for 12-year-olds. Kids want desperately to grow up. We have to come up with something more substantial. We have to give them an idea of self-worth which goes beyond being flirtatious, goes beyond having the right size bosom age 12, which allows you to actually have a little bit of fat on your thighs, allows you not to be a dreadful imitation of a Barbie doll. But it's not to be done top down. You don't like top down with the health service. This is mental health service. It's got to come spontaneously from these little people themselves.
Excellent. Excellent.
Peter Hitchens.
Where did this sexualisation come from, exactly? Why is it that we now have this Babylon, which even affects small children? Could it conceivably because we decided back in the 1960s to change our moral climate? This is actually a job for the Archbishop, not for me, it seems to me, that we decided that we were going to stop being a Protestant Christian country which believed that the main form of sexual relationship was lifelong marriage, and that we were fairly Puritan about sex, and to become instead a post-Lady Chatterley society in which sex was like tennis. It was just something you did, it was pleasure, there were no rules about it, and everybody should talk about it all the time. It should be on television the whole time, it should be on the radio the whole time, it should form the lyrics of all the songs that people listen to, which it is. Out of the radio it comes, out of the television it comes, out of the internet it comes. They go to school and they get sex education, which is actually all about taking away their innocence. And all these forces combine. That's what else is the purpose of sex education? We're told again and again that it's supposed to stop underage pregnancy, it's supposed to stop sexually transmitted diseases. And what happens? The more sex education we have, the more sexually transmitted diseases. The more abortion, the more underage pregnancy we have. It's demonstrably so. So okay, you're in favour of the sexualisation of children, then we've got that straight. And indeed you are. Our culture is. And so to stand here after 50 years of this and say, oh, let's have a law against selling padded bras to small children, seems to me to be on the level of futile gesture.
Okay. And the newspapers, of course, play their part. I noticed the Mail was described by Ofcom as showing significantly more graphic and close-up material than was on television when there were complaints about Rihanna being on X Factor.
Yeah, well, that was just Ofcom trying to get out of a fix that they were in by blaming somebody else. Yes, they'd let something through which they shouldn't have let through.
And they say they blamed the Mail.
That's what a lot of people do.
It's what the Speaker of the House of Commons does.
It makes them happy somehow.
The Speaker of the House of Commons describes as a sexist, racist, bigoted comic cartoon strip, your group of newspapers.
I should stress here for a moment, but not because in any way I wish to disown my sister paper. I work for the Mail on Sunday, not the Daily Mail. I'd be very happy to be described in such uncomplimentary terms by the Speaker. I would take it as a compliment.
The woman in the third row there.
Yeah. There were several problematic things about Bailey's report. One seemed to me to be the absolute absence of actually any research involving children.
Yeah,
or
Reg
young
Bailey, I
people.
should say, is the person who produced this report for the Others Union, yes.
And it seemed to me that children themselves were actually totally absent from this, and I don't know who's actually talking to children and young people about their views about how sexualised our culture is. I think that this kind of moralising tone, creating this bogeyman of the media or a bogeyman of retailers, those people have some responsibility, but if we don't talk about young children, how to equip them and empower them to navigate this world, we are doing a massive disservice to young people. And we talk about the government, you know, that the government only has so much it can do, and I agree about the censorship stuff, that it's just going to make stuff more appealing, but the government is also, funnily enough, involved in sex education. The sex education that we have in this country is not consistent, is not actually mandatory, and does not cover key issues. Really comprehensive sex education that covers consent, that covers self-esteem, that covers pleasure, that covers desire, that covers gender, and that covers media literacy would equip young people to better navigate the world we're in, because people are not going to stop trying to sell them stuff.
So, of course, this report to the government, which the Prime Minister accepted, had 14 recommendations, Andrew Mitchell. Do you think that the government actually can do anything about inappropriate sexualisation, and can these recommendations be enforced?
Well, I approach this issue as a parent of 2 girls as well as a politician. And I think that in tackling what's going on behind Anne's question, we should recognise that the parent is the first line of defence. On a Saturday morning, when I took my 2 daughters to buy some magazines, I exercised a certain amount of censorship over what they could have, and I have to say I was astonished at some of the stuff that was available to them. So I think the parent is the first line of defence. I think after that, it is of course for companies and businesses to exercise self-restraint and self-regulation, and in his report, Reg Bailey recognises that, and as the Prime Minister said, if self-regulation doesn't work, in 18 months' time we will return to the issue and we will consider legislation.
Okay, so all right, Charles Clarke.
In answer to Anne's question, David, I don't think the government has any teeth in relation to this, and I think it's a serious mistake for the Prime Minister to do what Andrew just described, to imply that it could come in with legislation in 18 months' time and, as it were, solve this problem.
Why?
Because I don't think legislation is the means for doing it. I agreed very much with Germaine's answer, and the key word in what she said, in my opinion, was self-worth. The question is for children, for young people, to have self-worth and self-esteem and self-confidence in what they do. The people who will help them gain that self-worth and self-esteem are their parents, in precisely the way, Andrew, which you described yourself as doing last weekend, the grandparents, the friends, and so on. And what society ought to be doing, perhaps this is an appropriate use of the word big society, actually, as opposed to the state, the government doing it, is trying to encourage children to have self-worth and to try and diminish the impact of these various pressures that are being described. And I think that really is the way to go. And I think it's true in a lot of these social areas. The illusion that the government can act through legislation is self-defeating.
So age rating videos and insisting that certain magazines are put out of reach and all that sort of stuff.
There are certain things that can be done to assist parents, and I think things like rating of videos is a good example where you've got it. Some of the controls which are suggested for pornography on the internet, which can help parents, I think are good things too. But I think the concept of what the government can do ought to be how can it assist parents, grandparents and children themselves control what they're doing rather than to stop them doing things.
The man at the back there in the striped shirt, you say.
I think that Mr Hitchens' suggestion that if we don't buy into his historically inaccurate and rose-tinted view of pre-60s sexual morality, we therefore support the exploitation of children, that's a false dichotomy and it doesn't help us get anywhere with resolving the issue.
All right. Yes, you sir.
I'd just like to take exception to what Germaine Greer said about dressing your children as tarts. I've got 2 young girls, and they're teenagers now. My daughters have never been dressed as tarts. And also the coy kissing of daddy before they go to bed. Surely they give me a kiss because they love me.
That depends whether a child is being taught to flirt with you rather than simply, I'm sorry.
Who's going to teach my children to flirt with me? That is an awful thing to say.
there are all kinds of ways of kissing your children, but there's one thing I'd like to say here, which is that kids don't have a single culture. They have all different cultures, and schools side by side in the same street can exhibit very different behaviours because it's the way the kids in those schools define themselves. So we have some schools where the girls wear their uniforms right down to their ankles, and others where they wear them as short as they can possibly get them. It's all part of the way they define themselves, and they can define themselves in opposition to a prevailing morality. When you're a child, what you're doing is forging your own path. Parents might like to think that their kids want to have sex the way they do. They're almost certainly wrong. But what we have got to understand is how creative kids are and how the development of sexuality has to do with their libido and their creativity.
But you did say what offended that father and might offend many other fathers listening, that there was something unnatural about girls being told to kiss their father.
Have you ever heard me use the word unnatural, David?
No, I didn't say it. Did you
You just said unnatural.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No.
You said it was whatever you did say. What did you say?
It's encouraging girls to be coy and manipulative in the way they approach other people. And that's something that enters right into the culture.
All right.
And we want our girls to be straightforward with us. We want them to be good chaps. But most of the time, they're being rewarded for a different kind of behaviour.
That's how sick we are as a society. That people actually introduce sex into a goodnight kiss of a father to a daughter. Unbelievable. Imagination.
Oh, my God. I very much agree with the lady in the audience in the stripy vest, and I have to say I do disagree with you, Peter, that freedom of information about sex is the root of all of this. But I do remain very concerned about the sexualisation of much of our culture, whether it's the soft porn lads mags next to the pick and mix or the pop videos which almost inevitably have a very, very slender lady in a skimpy outfit showing lots of cleavage gyrating around. I'm worried about the message that sends to girls in particular, that what's important is the way that you look, and it's about that being a sexualised object is what's most important. I'm worried about the consequences, and somebody said, what did children themselves think? Well, the NSPCC did a study that revealed that 1 in 6 teenage girls from 13 to 17 had been pressurised into sex with their boyfriends. Girl Guiding did a study which looked at younger girls' attitudes. Nearly half said that the most negative thing about being a woman was the pressure to feel attractive. I think this is a major problem. Can the government have teeth and solve it all? I don't think the government can solve it all. This is a very multifaceted problem. It needs government, yes, to be able to regulate where that's necessary. The media does need to take a more responsible view. And it's not just the sexualisation. I mean, even children's television programming, even here in the BBC, 32% of the lead characters are male. What are these role models that we're putting forward? But parents and as consumers can have an impact as well. So the campaign Pink Stinks, for example, managed to stop the Early Learning Centre from selling its dressing up clothes where the girls were sold nurses' outfits but the boys were sold doctors' outfits. These stereotypes seep into consciousness at an early age.
Sorry, if the 32% of the heroes are male, what are the other?
Sorry, only 32% are female. Sorry, I got that wrong. It's a 2-to-1 ratio. Yeah, I mean, Dora the Explorer aside, you're not really finding that many great role models for young women, whether it's in actually goes all the way back, fairy tales, whatever else. I agree with Germaine. We want to reduce this pure sexualisation, but you need to replace it with something else for people to aspire to. So it's not all about
one small point if I might. Sex education is not freedom of information. Sex education is propaganda for promiscuity.
Oh, don't be...
Find out what they're teaching. Find out what they're teaching your children.
You've made that point.
Ridiculous.
The man in the beard,
Make it again.
No, there's no point in making it 3 times over, because if you make it once, we can, man with the beard.
Carry on saying
how do you instill self-esteem and censorship when there's semi-naked people everywhere you look? Billboards, buses,
So you think that just the culture is against this, and you, sir, there?
You've said many times on the panel, and the gentleman behind me has just said, the point is, sex sells. So what hope have we got of any industry self-regulation while they're making money off it? This needs legislation.
And you, sir, and then we'll move on.
I think the key issue is in relation to parenting that's been touched upon. In my role as a police officer and my wife's role as a teaching assistant, we see lots of examples where there is inadequate parenting in lots of different ways, and I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's really where it starts, and until there's effective parenting and children are given good examples from a very early age, then this is one very small example of lots of ills in our society at the moment.
Thank you very much. Right. A question from Jodie Shanahan Prendergast, please.
Is it right to seek to become a development superpower at a time when public services are being slashed?
Is it right to seek to become a development superpower? Andrew Mitchell on my left here said we are a development superpower. He's in charge of overseas development and money and the rest. Is it right to seek to become that at a time when public services are being slashed? Peter Hitchens.
No, though I don't necessarily think it's a question of public services being slashed. It's at all. I think that there is a strong argument against a great deal of this aid. Much of it is misdirected. Much of it ends up in the hands of despots. Much of it is wasted. And a lot of it doesn't stand up to much examination. Quite a lot of it does a great deal of damage. And I think it's an overrated form of activity. Peter Bauer, the great economist, said it was a way of taking money from the poor of the first world and giving it to the rich of the third world. And in many cases, he was absolutely right. So the interesting thing is, the reason why this government, which many people wrongly think is conservative, is so committed to this very, very left-wing liberal idea that by spending lots and lots and lots of taxpayers' money gathered from not particularly well-off people in this country in the third world, they're necessarily going to do good. They're not. I think Andrew Mitchell knows that perfectly well. He knows what his own department does and how much of his own department's money goes astray, and how much of it, for instance, has to go, in any case, through the European Union. I think nearly 20% of our foreign aid is actually spent by the European Union on our behalf, in many cases on things which we don't particularly approve of and have no say on. So I think there should be a good deal more scepticism about foreign aid, and a lot less open-mouthed belief that just because it's called aid, it actually helps anybody, because a lot of it helps the wrong people and a lot of it helps nobody at all.
Andrew Mitchell, what you actually said was, as the Americans are a military superpower, we're a development superpower. What do you say to what Christopher Hitchens said?
Well, I don't pretend for a moment that this is an easy issue. But I want to make it clear that I think it was an important thing when the government said, when the coalition was formed, that we would not balance the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world. And I think that was the right decision, and I'm proud of being a member of a government that took that decision. Now, we could, of course, completely understand Peter's point that you will never maintain support for Britain's development programme unless you can demonstrate to hard-pressed taxpayers that for every pound we take from them, we are actually getting 100 pence of delivery in terms of development on the ground. And over the last year, that is what we have set out to do. We've made independent the evaluation of British aid so that people don't have to rely on the word of ministers who can sweep inconvenient truths under the carpet. They've got independent corroboration of whether this programme works well, and we've focused on the results that the programme, all the programmes around the world can deliver. And we've done this for two reasons overall. First of all, because it is morally right to do something about these appalling discrepancies of opportunity which exist in our world today, which our generations, for the first time ever, have a real chance of correcting and ameliorating. On Monday, we're going to have a huge conference in London with people gathered from governments, from private sector companies, from philanthropic foundations, to try and sign up to vaccinating 250 million children around the world who die from diseases. Every 20 seconds a child dies from disease in our world today that we are entirely able to prevent.
You describe what you're doing, but what do you say to the nub of this question, which is that when other things are being cut, why should this be protected? Indeed, why are you going to legislate to spend 3/4 nearly of 1% of our national product on aid, 0.7%?
Because we believe it is absolutely morally right to do so, but we also believe it is absolutely in our national interest. I was recently in Somalia, a country from which emanate all sorts of threats to Britain. The threat of terrorism. It is the #1 source of terrorist attack on Britain from Africa. Migration, this weight of people who want to come to the richer world. It is a source of drug running. It is a source of disease spreading. Tackling those causes of dysfunctionality, tackling the causes of poverty upstream, is much cheaper than having to deal later on when they burst out into dysfunctionality and you have to send in the troops. Far
so it's
more
self-interest,
expensive.
really.
So it is both morally right and also absolutely in our national self-interest to stand by this commitment.
The woman in the fourth row.
I'd just like to cite one of my own experiences volunteering in Nepal, but first I'd like to ask Peter Hitchens, have you ever been to an underdeveloped country before? Have you ever seen it firsthand?
Lots of them, yes. How many would you like me to list?
Just one or two, but which?
Okay, Somalia.
Okay. Well, I'd just like to say that
Middle
I
of a
have...
famine.
Okay.
Caused by politics.
Okay, well, I went to Nepal, where I saw philanthropy working firsthand, and I saw that actually foreign aid can stop young girls who are parentless from being sold into prostitution over the border into India. It can stop the disabled from just dying.
It can.
Because, no, let me finish,
for
please.
Instance, no, hang on.
No, let me finish.
Well, you've done better than I have. You've silenced him. Go on, Peter, just let her...
She got the right answer to the first question, so she's now trying again.
No, I'm sorry, but I'd like to have my say. So, there is a precedent in this country that we would not allow the disabled to die just because they cannot work and live and earn a livelihood. And this is what foreign aid protects. It's the basic human rights of people around the world. We, thankfully, live in a democratic country where our rights are protected. However, across the world, the rights of other human beings are not.
And what do you say to the question, which is that when public services in this country are being cut, the overseas aid budget is being protected?
Well, at that point, I look to actually some things provided by the state that we are very lucky to have. And people in this country, although some might be extremely poor, they will not be allowed to fall under the radar if they call on community services in the right way. And I do believe it needs to be strengthened.
And what do you say when you discover that some of this money is spent on dancing lessons for Africans?
Yeah, but we'd stop.
Or building motorways through
I have to just say,
settlements.
Germaine, no, okay, you've had your say. Germaine Greer. No, Germaine Greer.
Matter, does it?
Germaine Greer.
Okay. 35 years ago, we pledged 0.7% of our gross national income to the overseas development aid effort. Out of self-interest, if you like, because one of the things we're supposed to be doing out there is growing markets. We're going to need markets. We can't actually sell to people who have no wealth of any kind. It was self-interested, but the interesting thing is nobody did it. We got to half that, 0.4 maybe, but many other countries at 0.2. The Americans reneged for all sorts of reasons. The actual calculations have been distorted because emergency relief has been presented as overseas development aid when it wasn't. Overseas development aid should be to aid the development of these countries, and I agree, it should be properly administered.
And should it be given, for instance, to a rich country like India?
Well, in what way are we going to call India rich?
Well, I'll tell you one way. We give as much to India in aid as India gives in aid to the other countries outside India. We give a figure of 300 million.
If you
we give 295 million to India, and India gives 300 million itself in overseas aid.
It's overseas credits, it's not aid.
It has nuclear weapons. I think that's one way of telling it.
Oh, for goodness sake, look, we play these games with figures all the time.
Well, it's about figures that the question was put.
Well, not is it? Because really it's a question of administration and organisation. We are forever having to pay huge amounts of money for emergency relief. One of the reasons where we have to actually air freight in the things we are bringing to people who have nothing in a state of emergency, if we were actually properly organised, if we'd actually supported those societies properly, we wouldn't have to do that.
Okay.
It's all the outcome of penny pitching, underfunding, sloppiness. You don't get what you don't pay for. You've got to put in if you want to get out.
Let me go back to the questioner.
At the same time that budgets in the NHS are being frozen and public services are being cut, look, Pakistan is to receive £665 million sterling over the next 4 years. At the meantime, last month, Pakistan announced that it's to increase its military budget by 12%. And I was just wondering, why is it the responsibility of the British taxpayer to pay for public services in Pakistan that the Pakistani government should be paying themselves?
Charles Clarke.
The fundamental reason is the reason that Andrew set out. The moral case and the economic self-interest case. Just to take the example of India given by Germaine a second ago, the Open University's got a programme supported by Andrew and his department to educate teachers in India, to raise educational standards in India, which helps their prosperity, helps their health, helps the rest of it. That's moral interest, that's national interest. It is very much in our interest to do it. What I dislike about the conversation, David, is the idea that if we somehow put up walls around this country and forget that the rest of the world exists and somehow think we can just look after ourselves in some way, then the problems in the rest of the world will go away and won't infect us. In fact, they will, and they do, in the ways that have been described in a lot of different countries. Pakistan's an absolutely excellent case in point, where we have a massive interest in actually improving the prosperity, education capacity of the people of Pakistan, because from Pakistan come some of the most serious threats that we have to deal with. It's absolutely in our interest, and we should be doing it.
Mr. Prendergast, does that answer your question, or not? Are you happy with the answer?
I'll have to live with it.
You'll have to live with it. Joe Swinson.
Well, this is a long-standing commitment of more than 30 years, and I think actually it's shocking that it's taken so long to get to this point of us actually meeting that moral commitment that is also in our self-interest. I mean, I think in the previous government, I think Claire Short did excellent work in moving the issue of international development up the agenda, and I'm delighted that this government is taking it so seriously. Of course, there's the issues about making sure that it's transparent, that people know what's being spent, that it gets results, that money doesn't go into the hands of governments where we know there are corruption issues and that it's delivered through other partners in those countries. All of that has to happen. But, you know, I've been to Sierra Leone, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, in the aftermath of civil war that tore that country apart, where child soldiers had been conscripted and made to do the most appalling and unspeakable things, and where the poverty was just like nothing you could almost imagine. We have that moral responsibility, but we also know that in states where there has been conflict, where there is massive poverty, where there's big problems with their economy, that is where there is more likely to be a breeding ground for terrorism and instability that ultimately will affect us and be much more difficult for us to deal with when that erupts. Okay. So I think it is both morally right and in our country's interest to do this in terms of the aid budget.
Good answer. Andrew Mitchell, last brief answer, if you will.
Can I just come back on Peter's point about how all this money is stolen and misused? We have set up, the coalition government has set up the independent evaluation of aid, so you will be able to see for yourself whether this money is well used, because an independent agency will publish a report not sent to ministers but given to Parliament, to the relevant select committee, so you can see whether it's providing good value. And the transparency commitment, the fact that everything above £500 now goes out into the public domain through the net, we are committed to transparency because we understand that we will not maintain public support for this programme unless we can demonstrate real value for money and results on the ground.
Right. Thank you very much. We'll go on to another question. Oscar Pinnington, please.
Does a deliberate policy of rape by Gaddafi in Libya compel us to commit ground troops?
A deliberate policy of rape, which is the allegation of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court saying that rape was, organised rape, was a new aspect of Colonel Gaddafi's repression. Does that commit us? The rule, of course, at the moment under the UN is that we shouldn't put troops on the ground. Charles Clarke, do you think the result of this horrific accusation is that troops now should go on the ground?
Not directly. I think the question of putting troops on the ground is a matter that has to be considered by the strategic people looking at the best way of getting change in Libya, which I would say has to remove this regime and has to create a stable regime in which elections can take place.
What, not a question for the UN?
It is a question for the UN.
It is a question
sorry,
right.
What I'm saying is the direct link between rape and the rape allegations that are being made and the commitment of ground troops is something which I don't think is right. It is an appalling allegation against Gaddafi that this is happening, and it's right that it should be considered by the International Criminal Court so that he himself can be brought to justice there in those circumstances. But what I'm saying is the decision about whether or not to commit ground troops has to be one made by the UN Security Council on the overall strategic issue of what is the best way of achieving change in Libya.
Okay, you sir in the second row.
Is not sending the Apaches in this early halfway house to a ground war?
The helicopters going in. You think that's halfway to a ground war?
Well, they're based on ground attack. They are equivalent, really, to sending in ground troops.
Andrew Mitchell, do you think that this has changed the whole nature of our operations in Libya? The policy of rape? And you've just come back from there, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, these are appalling allegations, and they're not the first such allegations to be made by the ICC. We have also seen the use of cluster bombs by Gaddafi against his own people, blowing the limbs off children and adults, as I saw last weekend in a hospital in Benghazi. Does it mean that we have to commit ground troops? No, it does not. We are doing everything in accordance with international law, United Nations Resolution 1973, but it does underline the importance of Gaddafi going and his regime ending. I think that event is getting more likely, first of all because his military equipment is being very severely degraded from the air every day. Secondly, because he is suffering defections at all levels in his regime. And thirdly, because this work of the International Criminal Court has a very important effect on his support and his supporters, because they can see the great danger that they will be held to account and the age of impunity for them will be over. So I don't think it means we need to commit ground troops, and I am optimistic that we are going to be able to continue to protect the citizens, which after all was why the United Nations authorised this intervention in the first place. The intervention of the international community stopped a bloody massacre going on in Benghazi, which would have been far worse than anything we saw in Srebrenica, for example.
Peter Hitchens.
I'm sorry about this, but it seems to me that Libya is the business of the Libyans, not us. We have rapes taking place in this country, and as we see from the attempts by the Secretary of State for Justice, the government isn't particularly anxious to punish them.
Hang on,
wait a minute.
Stop you, but it's not a deliberate...
stopping me.
I do keep stopping you, because I think people listening to you would be quite surprised by what you said, that we have rape in this country.
We do.
What the International Criminal Court is alleging is rape being used as a matter of policy by Colonel Gaddafi. You're not saying that happens here.
You're not saying that happens here. I'm saying we have concerns in our own country. If you would actually let me say anything,
come on with it,
it would be easier. And the point that I'm making is this: we have many concerns in this country which are not being dealt with by a government which is uninterested in protecting its own population from an enormous amount of crime and disorder. And yet it poses as the saviour of the world in Libya. What business of ours is Libya? We have heard on many occasions in recent years stories about things going on in other countries to stampede us into supporting intervention. We were told about weapons of mass destruction aimed at this country from Iraq. This was false. We do not know if the allegations against Colonel Gaddafi's troops are true or not. I have no idea, do you? I don't think that it's something on which we can pronounce. But it does seem to me as if some attempt might be being made here to stampede the United Nations and this country and others into committing ground troops in Libya. Well, 5 years hence, when they're still there, and the coffins are coming back through Lynham or Brize Norton or Wootton Bassett or wherever it is, and you're saying, why are we still there? And why are people dying in this country in which we have no substantial interest? You'll know that it was because you were stampeded into yet another Middle Eastern war by a government that can't look after you at home, but which likes to show off its conscience and parade its wonderfulness by invading foreign countries. And I really do urge you very strongly to be sceptical about this sort of thing this time.
In Iraq and Afghanistan doesn't mean we should be scared of going into just wars. We have a moral obligation to help the Libyan people out, and we must do what we can. Yeah. I'm not too keen on ground troops, but it should be an option.
Well, you're the right age. Off you go. Sign up.
Yes. The man in the black and white. Yes, you.
It must be said that the current situation in Libya helps nobody. It's just prolonging a very vicious civil war. But as the Sunday Mail hack has pointed out, sending in ground troops will not necessarily help anything. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, we sent in ground troops. We removed the people in question that we were looking for, in those cases bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, and we're still there, and the situation is even worse. What is there to say that if we went into Libya, the same wouldn't happen? Why can't we try a different technique and perhaps negotiate with Colonel Gaddafi for his men to put down their weapons?
Curious to agree with him and insult him at the same time.
It pains me to say. It pains me to say that I agree with him. But I do.
Germaine Greer.
Rape is always present where you have slaughter, and you don't have to have a government fiat to do it. And one of the interesting things you might ask about what happens if we send in ground troops, how will we be sure they don't do a bit of raping in their turn? And one of the interesting things about the current situation is, surprise, surprise, allegations of rape are being made about the rebels as well. And who knows, I don't understand the psychopathy of warfare, but it seems to me you don't start it, because once you start this kind of situation, then all kinds of people suffer who are not a part of the conflict at all. But one of the curious things about this story is the allegation that Gaddafi's commanders have supplied the soldiers with Viagra in order that they're capable of raping. What I would have to say is, what's wrong with the Libyans? Everybody else managed without, as far as I can see. Give them too much Viagra, they'll be raping each other. The situation might just solve itself. It seems completely demented, the story that we're dealing with at the moment. There was another famous case where rape was alleged as a policy on the part of the Pakistani commanders in Bangladesh in 1971, and that was never stood up. It turned out to be another urban myth. Extraordinary notion that 300,000 raped women were left at the end of the war looking for husbands. It's not true. And I think in this case, we've got one of those legends you're going to hear about the hated enemy. All soldiers in certain circumstances will rape, regardless of whether they're ours or theirs or whose.
Do you think we should be in Libya in the first place, Germaine?
For goodness sake, it's an extraordinary thing, isn't it, that we supported Gaddafi, we sold him the weapons to suppress his own people, then when the people finally boil up, we suddenly change sides and decide we're going to be their saviors.
But were we right or wrong to do it?
We were hypocrites, as usual.
But right or wrong to go in?
I don't think we'll get out. It will probably turn out to be a tactical error.
The man in the white shirt there.
Hi there. I disagree that in certain cases we should shut our eyes and let things happen in the world. The question I would like to ask, and I do believe it's morally right to intervene in Libya, is do we actually have a means to do it now? Because the government is cutting defence capabilities, we're scrapping aircraft carriers, the British Army are having a record low intake, and with defence budgets being cut, have we actually got the means to intervene anymore? Because Britain has to relate its means to its commitments. You can't go involved in foreign adventures if you don't have the means to do so and to be a credible NATO partner. It's contradictory.
It is a very valid point being raised. Obviously, it's not purely Britain's moral responsibility alone. This is on the back of the United Nations Security Council resolution, and 17 different countries are involved in the action in Libya. And I think it's that United Nations backing that is what makes it so different from Iraq, and I do disagree with it. I mean, I was against the war in Iraq. I marched against it. I think it was an appalling mistake. But this is different. We've got international consensus about it, regional support from the partners. And when somebody said, you know, it's not helping anybody, I think the citizens of Benghazi, who heard Gaddafi say that he was going to roll in the tanks and go from street to street, from house to house and show no mercy, would disagree.
And ground troops being committed, that's the question. Should that now be the next step?
And what I would say is what is so important is the UN resolution, which very explicitly rules out an invading force in that way.
Would you like to see an attempt, sorry to press you, because we don't have much time, to have it changed to allow ground troops, or do you think it would be wrong in principle?
I'm not a military strategist, so I'm not best placed to say how to make sure that we can best ensure the security of the Libyan people. But that is what is in the resolution. That is what the key important thing is.
Right.
And I mean, these are just the most appalling allegations, but I think they have some credibility. They're not just being put out there by some random blog. This is the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court who is giving these credibility, and I just think it shows how Gaddafi has no respect whatsoever for the people that are his fellow citizens.
Andrew Mitchell, we're formally over our time, but do you think there may come a moment when the UN resolution, the British government will try and change it to allow ground troops into Libya to finish whatever it is that they want to achieve?
Well, no one is I mean, Peter has set up a straw man to knock him down. No one is suggesting at the moment that there should be any ground troops used in Libya. We are able to fulfill our commitments under the United Nations resolution in the current way we are doing it. That is allowing us to protect the civilian population from Gaddafi. That was what we were mandated to do, and that is why I say, for the reasons I set out, that I think we will be able to fulfil that commitment, I hope reasonably quickly, without the need for any ground troops to be committed.
Okay, thank you very much. We must stop now because our hour's up. We're going to be in Aberdeen next week, and we're going to be in Huddersfield the week after that. So Aberdeen and Huddersfield, if you want to come to the programme in those two places, the number to call 0330 123 9988. You can apply the addresses on the screen there. I'd just like to thank all our panellists here and all of you who came